managing tendinopathy can be a frustrating process, and there's even some amount of confusion between what is tendinitis, don't I have tendinitis, versus do I have tendinopathy, which essentially is just tendon pain that is more chronic in nature. The reality of it is a lot of people's tendon-oriented pain is actually more chronic than it is acute, and therefore there's less of an inflammatory process. We used to just basically broadly categorize things as tendinitis, which is just inflammation of the tendon. And the reality of it is a lot of people will have pain and there's no longer inflammation due to the length that they've been experiencing the pain, right? And part of that is also just inflammation is a part of the healing process to some extent, and a lot of people they no longer have the amount of acute inflammation that is typically seen when things are acutely healing. So when it comes to tendinopathies and managing tendon pain, and then ultimately progressing back to activities that like running, lifting, living life well, and no longer having tendon pain, we have to address things somewhat systematically. I don't like to think of things as like a perfect linear flow when it comes to any sort of bodily plan. I think it is good to make progressions and regressions, but there's no perfect timelines because individuals are relatively unique, and there's a lot of variability in humans. That being said, there's a lot of principles that we can utilize to help manage tendon-oriented pain and continue to do the things we enjoy while progressing back to normal function and zero or very minimally or very minimal pain, right? So, the first thing you want to kind of establish is, okay, do I have a tendinopathy going versus some other form of pain or injury, right? Some of the simplest things you can do are basically to assess whether or not, like, when you decrease activity, when you get up in the morning, are you like relatively stiff, and does that the pain you have, does it decrease with a little bit of activity, right? General like walking around or moving or biking tends to just get us like warmed up in a way that often helps tendon oriented pain, right? So if you have bicep oriented pain and you start to move your shoulder around, and that decreases the pain you feel to some extent, it's probably indicative of either tendinopathy or like maybe a little bit of a muscular strain, or a lot of times our body just responds to movement in a positive way, and so it can be hard to definitely distinguish, but a lot of times tendon oriented pain gets better with some loading, right? Acutely, it tends to decrease in pain, and then 48 hours afterwards we might get a pain spike in our tendon oriented pain, and that can be tricky because people will associate that with maybe that they did something wrong, which isn't necessarily the case. If it is maybe greater than a pain threshold that you've established, maybe we just did too much in that bout of activity or exercise, right? So thinking about the fact that we can grade our exposure, build up tolerance, and like we actually want to load the tendon, that's a really key component to the process of getting out of tendon oriented pain. So there's some big don'ts in the process, and those are you can't just rest a tendon like oriented pain. The nature of how tendons are like utilized in our body, they're viscoelastic, very collagenated, they are collagen tissues, and what viscoelastic properties basically do is they want to be like deformed, and then that deformation needs to come back, right? That's how you stress a tendon, is by the muscle contracting, the force from that contraction pulling on the tendon as it connects to the bone and ultimately moves us, right? So we want to actually stress the musculotendinous unit, right? And that implies, exercising, appropriately loading the tendon. So you can do that in a variety of ways, and I like to use the force velocity curve to kind of just think about this. You have on one end the zero velocity high force end of the curve, which is essentially isometric work, and then you have fast velocity, minimal force type of work, something we would consider maybe more speed oriented, and there's also endurance oriented work on that spectrum as well. And then on the other end, you have very high strength and force oriented work that's slow velocity. And you really want to train across that whole force velocity curve to improve the structure and the function and ultimately the pain of the tendon. Right, the pain is telling you that the tendon needs something, whether that be a little bit of rest, but it also needs to a build up in capacity. Right, so we want to not rest, and we want to train in a way that like facilitates adaptation a lot along the force velocity curve. Right. We also want to avoid things like injections because they're just not proven to be of any benefit. Despite the fact that they might manage pain, they don't really help tendon function, and they can actually be problematic down the road. The last piece is just something that is very common, and it's underloading of the tissue, and that's just to stretch, right? So often people go to physical therapy or a chiropractor or the doctor, and they're just given stretches for their pain. And stretching is not necessarily bad. It's just not adequate of a stimulus to create adaptation in the tendon the way we want to. There's basically two overarching phases in rehab, and those are calming things down, essentially decreasing the stress on the tissue that is painful, and then there's building up, which is gradually re-exposing stress to the tissue so that it can adapt and ultimately improve its capacity to do the things we want, right? Those two things kind of happen interchangeably and at the same time as we rehab an injury. Stretching may be an appropriate stimulus in like the beginning phase of rehab, along with maybe doing isometric work and that type of thing, because stretching is, after all, tensile load. It's just not typically enough to really get people where they want to go from a rehab and performance standpoint. So the big things to do on your tendonitis or tendinopathy rehab journey are to continue general training. And the reason I say to continue general training is, a lot of times people will get like a shoulder tendinopathy, or they'll get a jumper's knee, right? Or patellar tendinopathy, or they'll get Achilles tendinopathy. And they'll be told to just stop exercising or stop, doing anything that's provocative. And that kind of makes them think that they need to shut it down, right? And the reality of it is, because as I mentioned earlier, it's okay to have a little bit of discomfort in your rehab process. And it's also just really good to maintain your overarching metabolic health. Like, people who are metabolically healthy are typically respond better and get out of tendinopathies faster because you're just a healthier organism, right? And training is both psychologically and physically beneficial to you as a human, right? So continue to train. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we want to figure out how to load the tissue in a variety of ways that are not super provocative. And this could be where you basically take more of a stepwise progressive approach, starting with isometric work and maybe some stretching, moving into slow, heavy resistance oriented work, then going to slightly higher velocity work and more endurance oriented work, and then moving to higher force work and higher velocity work over time, right? A lot of that is essentially testing and retesting how the tendon is responding, and being careful not to necessarily overdo the work you're doing in the process. The exact specifics of those progressions and regressions are beyond the scope of this, because I'm just trying to give you an overarching feel for the rehab process here. But a lot of that looks like doing a combination of heavy resistance that's slow and that really, gets the musculotendinous unit, like it really makes the muscle work really hard, which pulls and puts a ton of tension through the tendon, and doing, 3 to 5 sets of heavy work on like a calf raise or maybe an eccentric oriented movement for the bicep. And then, normal isotonic, which are just moving in the eccentric and concentric, muscle contractions to just generally promote muscular tendinous strength and just overall capacity, moving into more velocity oriented things, because the tendon, after all, is like a energy transfer. The viscoelastic properties make it like a very much an energy transfer type of tissue, right? So moving fast, having a fast muscular contraction and that fast pulling on the tendon is also a way to help the tendon adapt, right? Throughout the process, probably the overarching thing is just matching the amount of work we are doing, the loading, to the ability that we can tolerate, and progressing that loading as the pain comes down. The pain is an indicator of if we are loading or if we are loading appropriately. If the pain spikes regularly, we're probably overdoing it. And this is where establishing a criterion for our pain levels is really important. And you can basically use like a red, yellow, green system, right? Red means, hey, that was too much pain. Often I just use the 0 to 10 pain scale, and anything above a 4 or 5 for most people is probably intolerable and too much. You may be able to do it for a little bit, but if you're continuously in that 5 range, it's probably too much work and we need to back off and slow down a little bit. The 2 to 4 range is the yellow, proceed with caution, monitor things closely. And then that 0 to 1 to 2 is usually like, this is the right amount of pain and work, and we're getting a good feedback loop that we're actually creating some adaptation, because a little bit of discomfort is actually an indicator that we're actually working the tendon, right? And then you just have to be okay with managing that discomfort over time as you rehab, because managing a tendinopathy can take months of time, even if you're doing things really, really well. And that's often the most frustrating thing for people, is that can be a slow process to get over the tendon-oriented pain and really get back to full function. Often, people will have pretty darn high function despite their tendon pain, as they're getting back to closer and closer to being, 100%. You can still have some pain despite making significant improvements towards your goals. So the overarching things are to remember here are: rest is not adequate rehab. Loading appropriately and progressive is a big component of getting out of tendon-oriented pain, and allowing some amount of discomfort in the rehab process is totally normal. And the process will not always feel linear because of the fact that humans habituate to what we're going through really, really well. So, you might feel like, hey, I've been making a tremendous amount of progress, and then you might take a step or two back and feel like, oh, I'm not making as much progress as I wanted. And you actually are still continuing in the right trajectory. It's just progress kind of slows down. We also adapt to kind of where we're at from a discomfort standpoint, and it can just be very frustrating. So be patient. Know that tendinopathies can take time, a significant time to heal, and trust the process. And if you really get stuck, find a provider that can help you manage this and just clear the confusion and the uncertainty out of the process, and make these principles more specific to you and your unique case. That's all I got today. Appreciate you being here. Peace.